What's up, seniors? All right. So the years of 1964 to 1965 were the years in which Lyndon Baines Johnson was pursuing his Great Society programs. It's the programs that are increasing entitlement programs, spending programs, and especially in things like education and healthcare. And there's in 64 and 65, there's the four big pieces of legislation that go through. The Voting Rights Act, which is going to increase the federal government's ability to intervene in the South to ensure that black people have the right to vote. The bill is establishing Medicare and Medicaid, which give health insurance to the elderly and the poor from the federal government, respectively, coming through the Social Security Administration. A reform of immigration quotas so that the racist numbers from the 1920s are revised, and an increase of federal spending for schools. Okay, those are the four big things. We are focused, however, today on the Voting Rights Act and what brought Congress and LBJ to come out really strongly in favor of civil rights, especially voting rights, in 1965. And that was the events that happened in Selma, Alabama, in the winter and early spring of 1965. Okay. So essentially, coming off of 1964, you had the Freedom Summer, the murder of the three activists down in Mississippi who were, what they're doing is trying to get black people registered to vote. Okay, they get murdered. There is a success in 1964 of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which forbids segregation in public facilities or in private facilities, businesses that serve the public. So that was a huge victory, but it didn't talk about voting rights. And so there is Martin Luther King Jr. and the other civil rights leaders are engaged in trying to push for those federal protections for voting rights in the South. You have in some counties in the South, places where the less than 50% of the population is registered to vote because the local authorities have suppressed the ability of black people to register to vote. Okay, so it was a huge problem. Okay, and of course the civil rights movement is broken up at this point between the followers of Martin Luther King Jr., who again is not only working from these Judeo-Christian principles, foundational principles, but he's committed to nonviolence, committed to integration, and willing to work with white moderates in the Democrat Party. You have increasing among the groups loyal to him in the nonviolent wing of the party, people who are disillusioned by the white moderates in the Democrat Party, particularly coming off the 1964 Democrat Convention, where the black delegates from Mississippi were basically not endorsed by LBJ. And then you have the other wing of the civil rights movement, the black nationalists, okay? So what's going on in Selma is they're not involved in it, right? Because they've already kind of given up on trying to work with the federal government to work for integration. They're not interested in it. They want, they're not involved with King at all. So what's happening in Selma is King and also his allies in the nonviolent movement who want him to be a more radical, more demanding. But that's what's going on in Selma. So what are they doing in Selma? Well, they're going to demonstrate to promote voting rights. And they want, of course, another federal law that will protect voting rights. And they choose Selma. Martin Luther King Jr. chooses Selma for the same reason that he had chosen Birmingham for demonstrations in the summer of 1963, right, where there was that violence against the young people demonstrating there. He chooses Selma for the same reasons, because he believes the police in Selma, Alabama, are going to react violently. It's going to be on national television, and it's going to push Congress to act. It's going to push LBJ to act in the same way that JFK was pushed to act after witnessing the violence in Birmingham to propose the Civil Rights Bill of 63, which became the Civil Rights Act of 64. King is thinking the same thing is going to happen in Selma, and he's right, it does. Okay, so working with King is John Lewis, leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who is someone who's increasingly skeptical about the Democrat Party and the white moderates in it, but who's willing to work with King because voting rights is a big thing for them, and they're committed, of course, to those nonviolent principles and to integration. All right, and in charge of so they're working together to organize demonstrations. The sheriff of the county in which Selma is located It's called Dallas County, but it's in Alabama. It's the county in which Selma is located. This guy, Jim Clark, is a big segregationist. And he is he wears this pin on his lapel saying never, basically indicating that he's never going to let things change in Alabama to benefit black people. All right, he is supported by George Wallace, the segregationist governor who had initially challenged LBJ in the Democrat primaries of 1964, had withdrawn from the race so that segregationists would vote for Barry Goldwater, who was not a segregationist, but who didn't want federal intervention in the South, right? Okay, well, anyway, so George Wallace, the segregationist, is supporting Jim Clark. All right, and Martin Luther King Jr. was absolutely right about how Jim Clark was going to react. So as demonstrations get underway in January and February of 1965, Clark, this guy, not a good, okay, he arrests 3,000 demonstrators, puts them in jail. This includes King, it includes John Lewis. All right, so the deputies, sheriffs are kicking and clubbing people. They're throwing them into trucks. They're carting them off to jail. There's at one point a woman who she's shoved by Clark. She knocks him down. He gets up. The deputies throw the woman on the ground, and they pin her on the ground with a club. And the photos of this are widely circulated. So what's happening is exactly what King thought would happen. And in the North, all the white people are getting more and more upset, more and more like, this is horrible. We have to do something to help the black people in the South. February 10th, Clark arrests 165 protesters. He sends them on this march 3 miles outside of town. Okay, forced march. They're using electric cattle prods. Okay. And the violence is just escalating. So Clark punches this reverend, this minister, sends him flying down the courthouse steps in the county there, the county courthouse, I guess it is. The state troopers ambush marchers in nearby Marion, Alabama. They assault a woman and her elderly father, her infirm father. Her son, who's 26, tries to protect them. They shoot him in the stomach. He dies eight days later. It's getting really out of control here. King decides, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to dramatize the whole thing. We're going to organize a march from Selma to the capital, Montgomery, Alabama, where we're going to have demonstrations and speeches and petitions to Wallace to protect voting rights for black people. Okay, Wallace bans the march. Martin Luther King Jr. thinks that the federal judge will overturn the ban, but he's waiting for the federal judge to do that. He wants the march to be scheduled for March 9th, 1965, after he believes the federal judge will have overturned Wallace's ban. But there are these more excited younger people in the movement who want to go forward with the march on March 7th before the ban is overturned. They don't want to wait. That's a Sunday. Leading them is John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and some others. They've got about 600 marchers. They are going from, I guess, one of the churches where they were organizing to Edmund Pettus Bridge, which crosses into the edge of town. And a lot of them, they've got the sleeping bags because they're preparing to go on this march to Montgomery. Okay, the capital. And the sheriff, Clark, is waiting on the other side of this Edmund Pettus Bridge for the marchers. And he's on horseback, and he's got all sorts of police with him. And what follows is called Bloody Sunday. It's one of the most frightening, it's one of the most horrible moments in the civil rights movement in terms of violence. So you've got the state police yelling through a bullhorn for the marchers to turn around and go back to the church. They give them 2 minutes. One of the civil rights leaders, one of the protesters says, well, let's talk. They say no. And then after a minute, I think it is, the police give the order to advance. And they run into the crowd like in a wedge. And they're clubbing people. They're beating people. Lewis gets hit on the head, knocked to the ground. He suffers a skull fracture. There's white people looking on, cheering. The troops are, the police are going through, whatever they are, troops, state troopers, I guess, going through the crowd, hitting people, throwing exploding canisters of tear gas. There's 5 women who are nearly beaten unconscious. Then Sheriff Clark, he's on horseback with his other policemen who are on horseback, And they order a final assault into the demonstrators. They're swinging bullwhips. They've got these rubber tubing things that are wrapped up in barbed wire, and they're swinging those, and they hit 70 demonstrators get sent to the hospital. 70 people get sent to the hospital. The rest are driven back to the church. This is Bloody Sunday. It is all captured on national television, and it is horrific, and it is going to have exactly the result that King believed would happen. I mean, he didn't want this violence to occur, but it's going to push the federal government into action. It's going to push white people in the North to get more involved. Okay, so we'll follow up all that leading up to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which we'll deal with in the next bit of lecture.